National Alka-Seltzer Day. Pretty much half the country's going to need one way or another. No, it's our National Election Day. So hopefully you get a chance to vote if you haven't already. It has turned into an ugly, ugly affair, and I cannot wait for it to be over. I imagine you all share that sentiment. No more political ads. Today is All Saints Day, a day where we remember those who have died from our congregation and in our families this past year. Or do you have something?
Am I heard?
Yes.
Okay. First off, there will be no leftover this Tuesday, so you can just stay home, snuggle up. It's supposed to rain and be cold, so stay home. Next Sunday is our Veterans Lunch to honor those members of St. Mark's that have served. We have an Aaron Rose. Anyone that would like to volunteer to make desserts, that would be welcome. There's also a book auction going on, and the monies from that will benefit the tiny homes. There's information on there if you haven't heard about it. It's little houses for veterans to help them on their life path. After service, there is social ministry meeting. So if you've been thinking about joining, you can always use members and ideas. Please come and join us, at least for a while. And this is usually where I would thank the cleanup volunteers for our annual fall cleanup at St. Mark's, which took place yesterday. But since only Jim and Joe and Paul and I showed up, you can just thank us for the work that got done. So,
his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmaster. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the countryside of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, Who is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. The word of the Lord. Second reading is from Galatians chapter 5, verse 1 and 13 through 15. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Not only do not use your freedom to an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour the other, take care that you are not consumed by one another. The word of the Lord.
Well, Jesus went on to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. And the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And making her stand before them all, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. What do you say? They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and then said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Once again, he bent down and wrote on the ground. And when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go on your way, and from now on do not sin again." The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
The last line of this, "Go on your way and do not sin again." Well, how realistic is that for any of us? Maybe Jesus meant something different here. We're going to come back to this story in a little bit. So Jesus, so last week we had a story about Jacob and Esau, and they were rivals, and Jacob stole his brother's birthright and then fled. And then came the time for them to get back together as adults. And Jacob was afraid, so he kind of pushed his wife and his servants and everybody out across the river. He stayed behind and had a night of wrestling. And then the next day, his brother came running to him and reconciled with him. And from there, Jacob gave birth to a son, to 12 sons. He went and had a relationship with a man named Laban, who was a landowner and a householder, and he wanted to marry one of their daughters, and so he worked for 7 years, and then only to find out that he had to marry the older daughter first, not the one he really wanted. And so each of the wives gave him 6 children, thus to become the 12 tribes of Israel. And one of those children was named Joseph. And Joseph, you probably know this story pretty well, had a coat made out of Technicolor dreams, something like that. He was the favored child. And so, as the story goes, out of revenge or rebellion, his brothers sold him to Ishmaelite traders traveling through the countryside. And he ends up in Egypt. And because of his ability to foretell dreams, he had Pharaoh understand that there's going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of scarcity. And so, with Joseph's help, they build barns and store the grain. And after 7 years, they're the only ones who have food in the region. So what happens to Joseph's brothers? They all have to come looking for food. And Joseph has the opportunity to turn the tables on them and to do to them what they did to him. But instead, he reconciles with them. It's part of who he is. And today, in the beginning of our story, we have a man named Moses. And Moses was born at a time when a new Pharaoh had come into power. One that had no idea who Joseph was or what Joseph had done for Egypt. And he decided that all the Hebrews, instead of being people of power and wealth, would now be slaves to the Egyptians. And they would learn how to make bricks out of mud. And so, all of the Hebrew people were enslaved. And to make matters worse, the Pharaoh decided that what he was going to do is each Hebrew baby that was born, male, would be tossed into the Nile River. And over time, it was a sort of slow genocide. There would be no Hebrew people left. They would all have to take Egyptian husbands if they wanted to have children. But before all that could happen, a Hebrew woman gave birth to a little boy, and she hid him for 3 months, so he would not be put into the river. And she took this baby. After 3 months, she could hide him no more, and she put him into a little raft made out of reeds and tar paper and baling wire, duct tape, whatever she could find, and cobbled it together, and down the river it went at just the right time when Pharaoh's daughter was bathing in the river. And she saw this little package coming down, and it must be for me. That's how people of privilege often think. Must be a gift from the gods to me. And so she took this baby as her own. And her father said, well, if you're going to do that, you have to find someone to be his wet nurse. And so she went to the Hebrew women and found his actual mother. And not only did his mother get to raise him, she also got paid for doing it. It's a great story. So Moses grew up a Hebrew, circumcised on the 8th day, but he was also living in the palace, in a life of wealth and privilege and great education. He kind of grew up with one foot on each side. And eventually, as he was older, he came across an Egyptian man beating one of the slaves. And he had to take a side. It says that he looked left and he looked right, and he didn't see anybody. In other words, he could do something about this and not be noticed. And so he went and he attacked the Egyptian slave master, wound up killing him. He thought he had gotten away with it. A couple days later, he saw a couple of Hebrew people in a quarrel, and he came and he wanted to help them settle their quarrel. And they said, what are you going to do? Are you going to kill us too? And he realized that someone had seen, or people were talking. So, for fear for his life, he fled the country. He left everything behind that he had. And he went out into the desert. And when he got there, there was a well. And there were some young girls at the well with their sheep. And they were wanting to give water to their animals. But some men came and were chasing them off, maybe threatening them. But Moses saw them, and part of who he was someone who stuck up for people who couldn't stick up for themselves. That was part of his identity. And these girls were so vulnerable, and so he allowed them to come and feed their animals. In fact, he took and drew water himself to feed their animals. The word got back to their father, and their father said, who was a Midianite priest, he said, bring this man to me. And so he gave him a home and one of his daughters to marry. And they all lived happily ever after, right? Well, Moses one day was tending the flocks, minding his own business. And out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that there was a bush that was on fire. Yet, it had been on fire for quite a while, and it was not burning up. It was still blazing. Things are so dry in the desert, they burn real quickly. And so it kind of caught his eye, so he came over, and he stood near the bush and just looked at it with awe and amazement. And then he hears a voice in his head that says, Moses, take off your shoes, your sandals. You're standing on holy ground. And so he does, and then he begins to have a conversation with God, the God of his ancestors. And God says, I want you, Moses, to go to Egypt. And he's like, yeah, no, not happening. I've been there, done that, not doing it again. I got the t-shirt. God says, no, I have heard the cries of my people, Israel. And I want you to go and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And of course, Moses is like, I am no good at this. I am not good at this. Plus, I'm wanted for murder. He didn't bring that part. And so he agrees finally with Aaron's help to go and talk to Pharaoh and to say, let God's people go. And Pharaoh has no inclination to do that whatsoever. I'm sure he laughed. And so one by one, the gods of the Egyptians were assaulted. There were 10 primary gods in the pantheon of the Egyptian gods, and each one of those gods corresponded to a plague that happened. One of the plagues was frogs 3 feet thick everywhere in the desert on a really hot day. You can imagine how that went. Well, you might think, what an odd way to have a plague. Where does this come from? Well, the fertility god of the Egyptians had a frog head. Another one of the Egyptian gods was the god of the moon, and God turned the moon to blood. Another one was the Nile River, a god of the river. And each one of these gods was bested by a plague of Moses. And finally, Pharaoh, in utter frustration, just says, go, take them, get them out of here. And so Moses takes the Israelites, and they march out into the desert, and Pharaoh says, yeah, I think not. I'm going to go get them. And he hails his chariots and soldiers, and they come after them. And they are riding out into the desert, and the Egyptians are riding on chariots, and the Israelites are walking through the desert with a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day, leading them to the Red Sea, where Charlton Heston pulls out his staff and puts it in, and the waves open, the waters open, and the people of Israel walk through. And then the chariots come, and they start following after this dramatic scene, and eventually the waters close up. And the fate that Pharaoh had for all of these Hebrew baby boys is now the fate of all of his big Egyptian men. The story is about identity. The identity of Moses being part Egyptian and part Hebrew. The identity of God, who says, I am who I am. Go and tell them I am the God of your ancestors. It is about the identity of these vulnerable girls feeding. All they needed to do was to feed their animals who were thirsty. And in our gospel for today, it is about the identity of a woman caught in adultery. Last time I checked, adultery usually had more than one person. Where was the man who was not brought in front of everyone to embarrass them? This poor, vulnerable woman, Jesus saw her. It wasn't that he thought adultery was fine, it's okay, doesn't matter. What he saw is not an adulteress, but a vulnerable woman, a child of God. Jesus stepped in, and he set her free from her accusers. As Moses came and set the Israelites free from their slavery, and now the burning bush still burns if you stop and look. And if you you stop and you take off your shoes, the burning bush will speak to you. It will call you to be people who have been set free so that they can help to set others free. God calls us to set free the vulnerable of our world, those who have no say. Part of God's identity and what made God different than all the other gods was that God was on the side of a bunch of slaves, not on the side of the masters, not on the side of the wealthy, the ones who make the rules. But our God is on the side of the most vulnerable. And he showed us that on the cross when he was stripped naked and hung in front of everyone to die. God's very identity is that of vulnerability and love. And if we hear the message of the burning bush, God calls us to be vulnerable and to give ourselves